Recognized. We currently have a $20 trillion debt. And you might ask yourself, whose fault is it? Republicans or Democrats? The easy answer is both. Both parties are equally responsible, equally culpable, and equally guilty of ignoring the debt, ignoring the spending problem, and really, I think, allowing our country to rot from the inside out. This year, the debt will be $700 billion. The deficit will be $700 billion for just 1 year for our country. $700 billion. We borrow about $1 million a minute. Under George W. Bush, the debt went from $5 trillion to $10 trillion. Under President Obama, it went from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. It's doubling under Republicans and Democrats. So right now, we're in the midst of another spending frenzy. Now, people will say, well, we're spending the money for something good. We're going to help those in Puerto Rico and those in Texas and those in Florida. My point is if you're going to spend money to help someone in need, maybe we should take it from another area of spending that's less in need. I think that just simply borrowing it, even for something that you can argue is compassionate, is really foolhardy and may make us weaker as a nation. Admiral Mullins put it this way. He said that the number one threat to our national security is our debt. In fact, most people who follow world politics, while we do have problems around the world, don't really see us being invaded anytime soon by an army or an armada. But people do see the burden of debt. So what we have before us is a bill, $36 billion. Much of it's going to Puerto Rico and Texas and Florida. My request is very simple. We should pay for it. About a month ago, we had $15 billion for the same purposes. We are set, in all likelihood, to have over $100 billion spent on these hurricanes. I simply ask that we take it from some spending item that seems to be less pressing. I mean, we could go through a list of hundreds and hundreds of items, but one thing I would think that we could start with why don't we quit sending money to countries that burn our flag? So if you are a country and you are saying death to America, burning the American flag, maybe we shouldn't give you any money. We give money to Pakistan. We trade and sell arms with most of the Middle East that don't like us. And we do this with borrowed money. We don't even have the money we're sending. But we could make the burden a little less if we would say, you know what, let's don't give any money to countries that hate us, to any country that's burning our flag. In Pakistan, there's a Christian woman by the name of Asia Bibi. She's been on death row for 5 years for being a Christian. She went to the well to draw water, and the women of the village began chanting death, death to the Christian. As she was being beaten and pummeled on the ground and thought she was going to die, the police finally show up, and they thought they were there to rescue her. They were there to imprison her. They took her off to prison. That was 5 years ago. Not easy being a Christian in the Middle East. In Pakistan, there was a doctor who helped us to get bin Laden. His name is Afridi. He's been in jail now for about 5-6 years also. So he helped get us information that helped us to target bin Laden and finally get this great enemy of our country. The Pakistanis put him in jail for helping us. The Pakistanis help us one day and stab us in back the next day. The Taliban, when they were defeated under President Obama, when he put 100,000 troops in there, they scurried off into Pakistan. They have a sanctuary, and then they come back. I think we ought to think twice about sending money to countries that burn our flag, sending money to countries that persecute Christians, sending monies to countries that frankly don't even like us. We spend about $30 billion helping other countries. Well, you know, if you were going to help your neighbor, if your neighbor was without food, would you first feed your children? If you had a little money left over, help the children next door? That's what most people would do. If you're going to give money to your church or your synagogue, would you go to the bank and borrow the money to give to somebody? Would that be compassionate or foolhardy? Is it compassionate to borrow money to give it to someone else? So people here will say they have great compassion and they want to help the people of Puerto Rico and the people of Texas and the people of Florida. But notice they have great compassion with someone else's money. Ask them if they're giving any money to Puerto Rico. Ask them if they're giving money to Texas. Ask them what they're doing to help their fellow man. And you'll find often that it's easy to be compassionate with someone else's money. But it's not only that. It's not only compassion with someone else's money. It's compassion with money that doesn't even exist, money that's borrowed. Of the $20 trillion we owe, China holds $1 trillion of that. And all this might be said, and you might say, well, we just have to help people. You're worrying too much, and you have to talk about details, and really all the money's being well spent. Well, if you look back at money that's been spent before in disasters, guess what? People replace everything, including things that weren't broken. I remember in Katrina, a family that was holed up in a beachside resort for weeks, taxpayer money. They could have put them up across the street for about $60 or $50 a night. They were staying in a $400 a night beachside resort with government money, with FEMA money. I think we have to look at how well government spends money. You want an example of how well government spends money? Last year, we had some great science. There's a lot of great taxpayer-funded science going on. They wanted to study whether or not Neil Armstrong, when he set foot on the moon, whether he said one small step for mankind or whether he said one small step for a man. So it's either one small step for man or one small step for a man. They wanted to know if the preposition a was in there. So they took some money that was actually intended for a good purpose to study autism, and they studied Neil Armstrong's statement when he landed on the moon, $700,000. In the NIH last year, they spent $2 million studying whether or not if someone in front of you in the buffet line sneezes on the food, are you more or less likely to eat the food that's been sneezed on? I think we could have polled the audience on that one. They spent $300,000 studying whether Japanese quail are more sexually promiscuous on cocaine. I think we could probably just assume yes. This kind of stuff goes on year after year. You think, oh, those are aberrations, that's new. William Proxmire was a senator, a conservative Democrat back in the day, and he used to do something called the Golden Fleece Award. He would put out these awards. They sound exactly the same as the stuff we're finding now. We spent money studying the gambling habits of Ugandans. We've studied how to prepare the Philippines for climate change. You name it, we're studying it around the world with money we don't have. I mean, if you wanted to make the argument, oh, we're running a surplus, we're a great country, we're going to help all the other countries of the world, I would actually listen to you if we're running a surplus. But we're not. We're running a $700 billion debt. We borrow $1 million a minute. And we got a lot of rich people here. You know what we ought to do is ask these rich senators, what are you giving to Puerto Rico? What are you giving to Texas? Instead, they're giving your money. They're really not even giving your money. They're giving money they borrowed. So what am I asking? Not that we not do this. What I'm asking is that, well, why don't we take it from something we shouldn't be doing? Or why don't we try to conserve? So if you decided you wanted to help the people next door, you might say, you know, I'm not going to the movie theater. I'm not going to go to the Broadway play. I'm not going to the NFL game. I'm going to save money by cutting back on my expenses so that I can help the people next door that are struggling, the father or mother out of work, and they need my help. But you wouldn't go to the bank and ask for a loan to help people. That's not the way it works, unless you're a government, and then common sense goes out the window, and you just spend money right and left because you're compassionate. You've got a big heart because you've got the ability of the Federal Reserve just to print up more money. But there are ultimately ramifications to profligate spending. We are approaching that day. Some say that you get there when your debt is at 100% of your GDP. We've now surpassed that. We have about a $17, $18 trillion economy, and we've got a $20 trillion debt. Is it getting any better? Have we planned on fixing it at all? No, there's no fixing. And is one party better than the other? No, they are equally bad. They are terrible. One side's at least honest. They don't care about the other about the debt. The other side are just hypocrites because they say, oh, we're going to win the elections by saying we're conservative. We care about the debt. But they don't. The debt gets worse under both parties. Voters need to scratch their head and say maybe they're both equally bad with regard to the debt. Most of the debt is driven by this. It's driven by mandatory spending. What is mandatory spending? These are the entitlements: Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, Social Security. This is driving the debt. It's on autopilot. So when we talk about a budget, nobody's talking about doing anything about the spending on autopilot. Why? It's risky to talk about reforming entitlements because everybody's getting one. If we don't, though, we're consigned to more and more debt, and ultimately I think we are consigned or resigned to a time in which the currency may well be destroyed and the country could be eaten from the inside out through this massive debt. Last week we voted on a budget, and from appearances you would say, well, the Republicans put forward a conservative budget, had $6 trillion worth of entitlement savings. In the first year, $96 billion worth of entitlement savings. But ask one Republican, ask any Republican in Congress, where is your $96 billion worth of entitlement spending coming? Most of them didn't even know it was in the budget. But it's in the budget to make it look good and look like it balances over 10 years. And yet there is no plan to do anything to entitlement spending. There is no plan to do any entitlement savings. There is no bill in committee and no bill that will come forward. So I introduced an amendment to the budget, and I said, well, if you're going to cut or save or somehow transform the entitlements into responsible spending where we spend what comes in and we don't borrow, why don't we put rules or reconciliation instructions into the budget to tell people, yes, we're honest and we're sincere and we're actually going to cut spending. You know how many people voted for it? There's 52 Republicans. We had 5. So they say they're for spending cuts, but they're not really, because nobody will vote to give the instructions to actually do the spending cuts. If you were to eliminate all of the budget that we typically vote on, the budget that we typically vote on is called discretionary spending. This is the military and the non-military. If you were to eliminate all of that, you still don't balance the budget. That's a third of the budget. You can't even balance the budget by eliminating a third of it. You have to tackle the entitlements. And yet nobody has the wherewithal, guts, or the intestinal fortitude to actually do it. Now, we did have a big fix once upon a time in the Social Security. In 1983, President Reagan and Tip O'Neill, Republican and Democrat, came together to say we were out of money, and we gradually raised the age of Social Security to 67. Now, is anybody happy to do that? Is anybody jumping up and down and saying, oh, I want to wait longer to get Social Security? No, nobody is, but if we don't do it, there'll be no Social Security because we're destroying the system. Social Security pays out more than it brings in. Now, once upon a time, it was the other way. We used to have about 16 workers for every retiree. Now we have about a little bit less than 3 workers for every retiree. Families got smaller. So when people ask me, how come Social Security is running a deficit? How come Medicare is? Whose fault is it, Republicans or Democrats? Really a little bit of both, but it's also the fault of your grandparents for having too many kids. We had a whole bunch of baby boomers born, and they're all retiring, but the baby boomers had fewer kids, and the baby boomers' kids had even fewer kids, so it's a demographic shift. But if we put our head in the sand and do nothing, the debt will continue to accumulate. We're accumulating debt by the billions and billions of dollars every year. This year, $700 billion, and it's estimated that it will be close to or may exceed $1 trillion next year. During President Obama's tenure, we had deficits of over $1 trillion in several years. We went over an 8-year period. We actually increased the debt over $1 trillion a year. It was about a $10 trillion increase in the debt in the 8 years of President Obama. If we look at whose fault it is, Republican or Democrats, it's both. But I'll tell you the way it works around here. People say it is noble. You are enlightened to compromise. So here's the compromise you get. You heard that 4 of our brave young men died in Niger the other day. Most of the people here didn't even know we were there, to the tune of 1,000 soldiers. But the people, once they heard about it, the Hawks, once they heard about it, they said, oh, we need more. They didn't know 1,000 were there, but they said, we need more there. We need more people in Niger. Now, no one's bothered to have a debate over what the war's about in Niger, whether we should be there or not, and whether we should send our brave young men and women there. Our founding fathers said that that was the first principle. The first principle of going to war, the initiation of war, the declaration of war, is to be done by Congress. They specifically took that power away from the president. It's not just about funding, although that's another way we control war, but the primary way we control whether we enter into war is the declaration of war. It's under Article 1, Section 8. This is where the congressional powers are laid out, and people say, oh, that's an anachronism. We don't obey that anymore. They certainly don't, but it was never removed from the Constitution. They just quit and began ignoring this. How important was this to our founding fathers? Madison wrote this. Madison said that the executive is the branch of government most prone to war. Therefore, the Constitution, with studied care, granted the power of war to the legislature. This wasn't just Madison who said this. It was Jefferson, Washington, Adams. The whole panoply of founding fathers said that war was to be initiated by Congress. We've had no vote, no debate, and most of the members didn't know we were in this part of Africa. And yet here we are. But the knee-jerk reaction by those on the right, typically, but some on the left, is that we just need more. We wouldn't have lost these 4 lives had we had 10,000 troops in a country that none of us knew we were going to be at war there. None of us fully have had debated who the parties are to the war, and yet we're going to be at war there now. And so the knee-jerk reaction is that we are to expand our role in this war in Africa. I had my staff ask a question. How many troops do we have in Africa? Nobody here knows. We looked it up, and we found out it's 6,000. We have 6,000 troops in Africa. You knew you were at war in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and Libya, but we didn't really know we had 6,000 troops in Africa. That would include Libya, but 6,000 troops are in Africa. The point of it is when you get back to the debate that we're talking about, the budget, is that there's a great deal of expenditures to have troops in 100 some odd countries. So we literally have troops in over 100 countries. We have 6,000 troops currently in Africa. It's expensive. So how do you convince the other side of the aisle to pay for it? Typically, the Republican side of the aisle says, Katie bar the door, we'll spend whatever it takes and then some on the military. The Democrats say, well, what about welfare? We need more welfare. So then they tell you to compromise is noble, to be enlightened, to be pragmatic, to compromise is what we should shoot for. We should work with the other side. So that's what happens. There has been a bipartisan consensus for maybe 50, 60, 70 years now, and that is to fund everything. If the right wants warfare, the left says we must get more welfare. If the left wants welfare, the right says we have to have more money for warfare. So it's guns and butter. It began in an aggressive way during the Vietnam War, but it's proceeded apace. We continue to spend money like there's no tomorrow, but both parties are guilty. It's the right and the left. It's compromise that's killing this country. It's the compromise to spend money on everything for everyone, whether you're from the right or the left. But you know, there could be another form of compromise. We could say that we wish to compromise in the reverse direction. We wish to say that, look, maybe for the Republicans, national defense is more important than welfare. And maybe for the Democrats, welfare is more important than warfare. But maybe the compromise could be, you know what, we don't have enough money for either one. Maybe the compromise could be we'll spend a little bit less on each. You know what? We did that recently. When I first came up here, was elected in this sort of Tea Party tidal wave that was concerned about debt, something was passed that was called a sequester. And guess who hated it? All the big spending Republicans and all the big spending Democrats. They couldn't pass out their goodies and favors enough because there was some restraint. And you say, well, I heard the sequester was terrible. I saw people at school and I saw people in my town saying the sequester wasn't giving them enough money. The sequester was actually a slowdown in the rate of growth of spending. And this is why you have to understand newspeak. Orwell talked about newspeak and how people change the meaning of words to make them meaningless or even to make them mean the opposite. So you hear all the time, when we had this debate over repealing Obamacare, we were talking about capping the rate of growth of Medicaid. You heard all the squawking on the left saying, oh, we're going to cut Medicaid. No, we were going to cut the rate of growth of Medicaid. So we had a sequester, and it was evenly divided between military and non-military, between Republican interest and Democrat interest. It did not cut, it slowed down the rate of growth of spending over 10 years. And it was actually working to a certain degree. We got it because people who were concerned about the debt fought and said, we need to be concerned about the debt. We're hollowing the country out from the inside out. So who destroyed the sequester? Really, the voices were louder on the Republican side than the Democrat, but both parties were complicit. The sequester's essentially been gutted and destroyed, and really the spending caps have become somewhat meaningless. So we have before us today $36 billion. It will exceed the spending caps. So we have a sequester in place, but there's all these exemptions. So it's exempt. So anytime you say it's an emergency, it's an exemption. Within the $36 billion, though, there's $16 billion because we run a terrible government-run flood program that's $16 billion in the hole. So we're just going to bail it out by letting it wipe all its debt off. That sort of sounds like long-term mismanagement and a bad program, badly run program, rather than it sounds like an emergency. And yet it's going to be stuck in an emergency bill so it can exceed the caps. So what am I asking for today? I'm asking that we obey our own rules. We set these rules, we set these spending caps, we set this sequester, let's obey it. The other side will say, oh, we're obeying the rules, we're just not counting this money. That's the problem. We have this dishonest accounting where people just say, oh, yeah, we're obeying the rules, but we're not. So there's a couple of ways you could pay for this. The first way I tried a couple of weeks ago. We had a $15 billion bill, and I said, why don't we pay for it with the foreign aid, the welfare we give to other countries? Why don't we say, you know what, it is time we looked at America first. It is time that we take care of our own. It is time that we spend money taking care of those in Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico, but let's spend money that we're going to send in the form of welfare to other countries. Maybe we should take care of our own. Instead, though, the Senate voted otherwise. I forced the issue. They weren't too happy with the amendment. I only got the vote because I was persistent and I threatened to delay things, and I was able to get a vote. You know how many senators voted for this? No Democrats. No Democrats wanted to offset any spending, and 10 Republicans did. So I think the vote was 87-10. 87 senators voted to keep spending money without any offsets, to basically just borrow the money. And now we're having the same debate again. I have an amendment to offset the $36 billion. Now, in all likelihood, I'm not going to get an amendment vote because they don't have time. It would take 15 minutes, and God forbid that we spend 15 minutes talking about how we're being eaten alive by a $20 trillion debt. God forbid we talk about how a $20 trillion debt is an anchor around the neck of the country. God forbid. God forbid that we offer an amendment and at least take 15 minutes to have an offset, to say we should pay for this money we're going to send to Puerto Rico and Texas and Florida, pay for it by taking it from some other element in the budget. So last time I offered foreign welfare. This time what I put on the table is something that is very similar to a bill that's been put forward and offered for several years called the Penny Plan. The Penny Plan is this. And there's a great illustration of this, if you want to look at this on YouTube, of a guy with a bunch of pennies and stacked and showing sort of in a visual way what it would be like to cut 1 penny out of every dollar. That's what we're talking about. 1% cut across the board would pay for this $36 billion bill. We have it's actually a little bit less than 1%. 1% of $4 trillion budget would be about $40 billion. So we need $36 billion, so it's less than 1%. Just cut the budget less than 1%. Do you think there might be 1% waste in every department, including even departments of government you might like? Do you think any American families ever had to deal with a 1% cut? Government is so wasteful at every level that we could probably cut several percentage points of every division and department of government, and you wouldn't know it was gone. I mean, the waste is astounding. When we look at where money is spent, we looked at some of the money that was being shipped overseas not too long ago, and one of the programs we found was a televised cricket league for Afghanistan. All right, self-esteem is real important, and you're paying for it. So we're going to pay for television so the Afghanis can feel better about themselves watching cricket on TV. First problem is we don't have any money. We've got to borrow it. Second problem is they don't have televisions in Afghanistan. Well, some do, but about 1 in 1,000 people have a television. I guess they're going to feel better about the Americans paying so they can watch cricket on TV. It's one thing after another. We paid $1 million for a variety program to put little songs and skits on their television. Once again, most of them don't have a TV to watch. In the war effort on Afghanistan, we spent trillions and trillions of dollars in the war effort. We've defeated the Taliban many times, and I'm sure we could defeat them again, but that just means they go across the border, hide in caves, and come back when we're tired. We spent $45 million on a gas station in Afghanistan. This gas station, though, is an interesting gas station. It serves up natural gas. You say, oh, that's great. We're lessening the carbon footprint in Afghanistan. Except for it's completely absurd because they don't have any cars that run on natural gas in Afghanistan. So they built a $45 million plant. The original estimates that was going to cost about $500,000. So it was like 46 times cost overruns, ends up costing $45 million. And it serves up natural gas that nobody has a car that runs on natural gas. So we said, whoops. And so we immediately bought them 24 cars that run on natural gas so they can go to the $45 million gas station and get their natural gas. But that wasn't enough because we had natural gas cars for them, but they had no money to buy the natural gas. So we bought them all credit cards. We bought them natural gas burning cars. We gave them a natural gas station, and we bought them credit cards to reduce the carbon footprint of those who are living in Afghanistan. This is absurd. When we look at the budget and we look at accounting, a lot of the money that's been spent overseas in the Iraq War, the Afghan War, the Syrian War, the Niger War, the Libyan War, the Somali War, the Chad War, a lot of this money isn't really budgeted. A lot of this money is actually done as an off-budget thing. It's called the Overseas Contingency Operation. And it's really a way of cheating, a way of being dishonest in your accounting. It's a way of evading spending caps. But it's also gone a long way towards making it easier just to keep spending money without restraint. So we tried to put restraints on military and non-military, and they're exceeded by this slush fund. They call it OCO funding, Overseas Contingency Operation. So when we had the budget vote recently, I put forward an amendment and simply said we shouldn't spend above our caps. If we put these caps in place, this is what we should spend. I think we got maybe 15 or 20 votes on that. But this is the problem. And ultimately, we have to decide as a country, are we going to obey the Constitution? Are we going to only go to war when we declare war, when Congress does its job, declares war? Or are we going to go to war anytime, anywhere? That's sort of what we do now. We go to war anytime, anywhere on the face of the planet, and it's not for free. Not only is it expensive in dollars, but it's expensive in lives. The young men and women that are sent to these wars, and yet no one's ever voted on them. We lost a soldier in Yemen 3 or 4 months ago. And for his family, it was devastating. But America pays little attention because America basically isn't fighting the war. A very small percentage of America, brave young men and women, often from rural parts of our country, are fighting our wars. But the mass of America isn't fighting. Now, you could say they're volunteers, and that is great, and I think that's the best kind of army to have. But I hate it that we don't show the responsibility and care of actually doing our job, of taking the time to debate it. Should we be at war in Yemen or not? Should we be at war in Niger? Should we be at war in Libya? Should we be at war in Chad? Should we be at war in Somalia, Djibouti, Pakistan, Afghanistan? We have troops in probably 20, 30 nations where there's conflict going on, and we're actively involved in the midst of conflict in at least 6 or 7. Very expensive in human lives and dollars. We need to ask ourselves, will we do this forever? Sunnis have been fighting the Shia for about 1,000 years. People say, well, we're going after ISIS in Africa. Well, ISIS is basically a name for radical jihadist Islam, and they're all over the planet. We're going to go everywhere and kill every one of them? Is there a possibility that when we kill one, 10 more pop up? Is whack-a-mole strategy for killing every terrorist on the planet or every radical on the planet a way we're going to win? We went into Yemen on a manned raid in, I think it was January or February this year, and we lost one brave Navy SEAL. They say we got information. They won't exactly tell me what information they got. They claim it was this great information that's going to make the war on terror so much easier. I have my doubts. In the raid, though, which was a manned raid in the middle of Yemen, women and children died. And I don't blame our soldiers. I've got members of my family who are active duty. They do what they're told. They take orders. And it's tough being put in a situation like that. You're dropped in the middle of nowhere in a village. Maybe the women and children are shooting at you as well. You have to defend yourself and complete your mission. And yet, I wonder whether or not the policymakers should be more involved with making a decision whether we should be in Yemen, and whether or not the people that live in the surrounding area to that village will, for 100 years or more, recite through oral tradition the day the Americans came. Whether or not we actually killed more terrorists than will be created by the oral tradition of when the Americans came. We are also aiding and abetting Saudi Arabia in this horrific war in Yemen. There are 17 million people who live on the edge of starvation in Yemen, and the war is exacerbating that. Yemen is a very poor country to begin with. They import about 80% of their food. Currently, the Saudis have a blockade, and so no food's getting in. They say it's to prevent arms, and I'm sure it is, but one of the consequences is no food. There's 500,000 people with cholera right now. This is sort of a bad form of dysentery, and in poorer countries, you die from cholera. 500,000 people with cholera. It goes along with no food, no clean water. The Saudis are blockading Yemen. The Saudis are bombing Yemen. We are giving the Saudis, or selling the Saudis, the weapons. We're refueling the planes and helping the Saudis pick the targets. Well, one of the Saudi targets about a year ago was a funeral procession. This was a funeral procession of a Houthi leader or rebel. And there were 500 people, civilians, who were wounded in that procession, and 150 killed by a Saudi bomb on civilians. Do you think they're going to soon forget that? Do you think that by killing 150 people in a funeral procession and wounding 500, that you killed more terrorists that day than you created? I would say that that day will live on in oral history for 1,000 years. The day the Saudis came with American bombs and bombed an unarmed funeral procession will live on for 1,000 years, and hundreds, if not thousands of people will be motivated to become suicide bombers because of the day the Saudis bombed a funeral procession. It's incredibly expensive in lives, their lives, our lives. When you look at the cause of famine around the globe, and you look at it extensively and study the causes of famine, probably 6, 7 times out of 10, it's war. War's a terrible thing. And if we don't acknowledge that and try to think, how are ways that we can make war the last resort instead of the first resort? I mean, for goodness sake, the people on television this Sunday didn't know how many troops were in Niger. And yet their immediate response is, well, we should have had more. We need more troops over there in Africa, in a place most Americans had not heard of, have no idea who's fighting whom, and whether or not it's an achievable goal. And they will say, well, 1,000 wasn't enough. If we'd had 10,000 and air support and all of this, we would have prevented these deaths. That's one lesson you could learn. The other lesson you could learn is maybe we shouldn't have been there at all. You see, people have to stand up for themselves. There's this idea of sort of self-rule and independence, and if people are coddled and not sort of forced into the position of defending themselves, they won't. So we've been in Afghanistan 16 years. In the 16 years we were there, what have we found? Well, about 60,000, 80,000 of the Afghans came over here. They were translators, and everybody says, oh, we got to help these translators. Well, they spoke English, and they were pro-West. They needed to stay in Afghanistan and create a country. The best people left, same as Iraq. We won the war in Iraq. All the good people came over here. I have nothing personally against those who came, other than I'm disappointed that there weren't enough people who are heroic enough to stay in their country to help build a new country. Who fights over there? Some of the Afghans fight. Some people join their army to shoot us. We have this green on green where their soldiers are shooting our soldiers because they come in and intentionally are there to kill our soldiers. The question is, how come after 15, 16 years, the Afghans can't fight to preserve their nation? Everybody now says, oh, if America comes home, the Taliban takes over. Well, the Taliban's not quite ISIS. They're also not quite the same international sort of jihadists. They did harbor bin Laden once upon a time. Most of those people are dead, if not all of them being dead. If you look at how terrorism ends, like when the IRA ended in England and in Ireland, it actually ended up being a negotiation. So some say we will never negotiate with the enemy. You know, if you never negotiate with the Taliban, they are unfortunately pretty popular in Afghanistan. They're going to be there forever. And can we kill them all? No, just like the radicals throughout the Islamic countries, I think there's too many to kill. And the question is, do you create more than you kill? But if you put this in context and you say, well, we have to be able to defend ourselves, our country needs to be strong to defend ourselves, I couldn't agree more. But you know what? We become weaker every day as we run up this debt. $20 trillion in debt, $700 billion this year. We borrow $1 million a minute. Realize that predicament, and then realize that the powers that be don't want to allow amendments to offset spending. So I'm proposing that if we spend money on Puerto Rico and Texas and Florida, that we offset it by taking it for something that's less of a priority, something else in the budget. If we were to cut 1% of the rest of the budget, we'd have more than enough to pay for this. Would anybody notice 1%? Sure, they'd have to push things around a little bit, but they'd all survive. We've looked at spending, and to show you how bad spending in the federal government is, it gets faster each month as you get towards the end of the year. So when there's only 1 month left, these bureaucrats go, oh my goodness, we might not be able to spend the money fast enough. So spending in the last month of the year is actually 5 times faster than any other month of the year. In fact, in the last month of the fiscal year, not only is it 5 times faster, each progressive day it gets faster. So the last month of the fiscal year is September. September 1, they spend the money like this. September 2, like this. September 3, like this. September 4, it goes up every day because they're trying to shovel the money out as fast as they can. If they don't spend it all, they're afraid they won't get it next year. The common parlance for this is use it or lose it. You get all the way to the last day of the fiscal year, spending actually increases and goes with the rising and setting sun. So it's 8 o'clock earlier here than it is in California. As the sun rises, we begin spending money in the east. We're shoveling out as fast as we can. As the sun progresses towards sunset, the spending shifts to the west coast. They're shoveling it out at 5 o'clock Pacific time, trying to get rid of the money. If you look when most conferences are, when most government employees go to a conference in Las Vegas, the last month of the year, they found they have some money. What's $1 million? You don't mind spending $1 million, right? You want these government employees to have a good time. So there was a group, I think it was a General Services a couple years ago, and you saw those pictures of the head of the GSA and his wife, you know, in a big Las Vegas hot tub, drinking champagne. And I think that was $1 million event. It was either at that conference or another one where they decided that it would be good and instructive to their employees if they actually had a Star Trek reenactment. So they hired Star Trek reenactors. With that, I'll reserve the balance of my time.